When a successful entrepreneur dies suddenly after a family dispute, a bitter battle over the inheritance erupts between his adult daughter and his son's young mother. One side claims that it was the conflict that caused the death and demands that the other be deprived of the right to property, while the opponent accuses her of trying to take possession of everything for the sake of the child. The trial reveals shocking details: betrayal, family secrets, and emotions on the verge of breakdown. Who is right, who is wrong, and who will get the fortune? Chapter 1. Beginning of the trial. The Cook County, Illinois, circuit courtroom was filled with a buzz of voices. The lawyers discussed the details of the case with their clients, and there was tension in the air. Along the hall, there were long rows of wooden benches on which sat several observers, journalists, and relatives of the parties to the trial. In the center stood the judge's massive oak desk, next to which was a stenographer ready to record every word of the hearing. There was the sound of a wooden hammer hitting a stand. "I ask everyone to stand," the bailiff announced, drowning out the noise in the hall. Everyone present stood up. Judge Robert Williams entered the courtroom, a tall man with gray temples, dressed in a black robe. He confidently took his place at the judge's table and carefully examined those present. After a few seconds, he nodded to the bailiff. "Please sit down," he said. The rustle of clothes and muffled sounds of footsteps filled the hall as everyone took their seats again. The judge opened the case file in front of him and briefly glanced through the documents. Today, the court is considering the case of Emily Carter, representing the interests of her minor son, Liam Walker, against Rachel Walker to recognize her as an unworthy heir and transfer the right to the entire inheritance of the child's late father exclusively to him, he announced in an even voice. The judge looked up from his papers for a moment and looked at both sides. "Plaintiff, are you present at the meeting?" Emily Carter, a young woman in her 30s with long brown hair, nervously clasped her fingers together and nodded. "Yes, Your Honor," she answered in a firm but slightly tense voice. "Defendant, are you present at the meeting?" The judge turned to the other side. Rachel Walker, a woman in her 30s with an arrogant look and blonde hair pulled back into a severe bun, folded her arms and looked at the judge. "Yes, Your Honor," she answered evenly. The judge scanned the documents again, then glanced at the parties' lawyers. "Are both parties represented by lawyers?" "Yes, Your Honor," confirmed the plaintiff's lawyer, a trim, bespectacled man named Mark Davis. "Yes, Your Honor," nodded a woman in a business suit, the defendant's lawyer, Sarah Miller. The judge leaned forward slightly and put his fingers together, as if weighing the situation. "Fine. Plaintiff, introduce yourself and state the essence of your claim." He turned to Emily Carter. The woman took a deep breath before speaking. "My name is Emily Carter, and I am here to protect the rights of my 3-month-old son, Liam Walker. His father, John Walker, died 3 months ago. The defendant in this case is his eldest daughter, Rachel Walker. I ask that she be recognized as an unworthy heir, since her actions led to the death of my child. Moreover, I demand that the entire inheritance be transferred to my son, since he is a direct descendant of John Walker and should not share his future with the man who endangered his father's life." Her voice trembled slightly, but she remained confident. Rachel chuckled and shook her head slightly, but didn't say anything. The judge did not pay attention to this. "Defendant, do you understand what you are accused of?" The judge clarified. "Yes, Your Honor," Rachel replied dryly. "Do you deny the charges?" He continued. "Of course, Your Honor." The defendant folded her arms over her chest and turned to the side. The judge nodded, making a few notes. "In that case, the court will hear the details of the case. Evidence, witness statements, and medical reports will be presented. The parties will have the opportunity to speak and present their arguments." The judge leaned back in his chair, looking around at the participants in the trial. "The meeting is declared open," he concluded. A tense silence reigned in the hall. The trial was just beginning. Chapter 2. History of Relationships. Emily Carter sighed heavily and looked around the courtroom. Her hands were shaking, but she forced herself to control herself. The moment came when she needed to tell the story of her love and struggle, the story that brought her to this hall. "Your Honor, I met John Walker a little over 2 years ago, Emily began, nervously clasping her fingers together. It was a difficult period in my life. I moved to Chicago after my divorce, leaving my past behind me, and started working at a law firm. John was my client. He was involved in real estate and asked for advice on rental issues. We met in his office in the city center, and from the very first moment, he made a strong impression on me. Emily was silent for a moment, remembering that day. The judge waited patiently for the continuation. He was a real gentleman, calm, confident, but at the same time with some kind of inner pain that he tried to hide. Later I found out that his wife died 3 years ago. He mourned her for a long time, devoted himself entirely to raising his daughter, Rachel, and to work. When we started dating, he often said that he felt guilty for finally allowing himself to be happy again. Emily looked at Rachel, but she looked away, crossing her arms over her chest. There was contempt in her eyes. We didn't live together, but we spent a lot of time with each other. John did not want to rush into official steps. He kept saying that he needed time to prepare Rachel. He was afraid that she wouldn't accept me, Emily continued. I didn't insist. I understood that he loved his daughter and wanted to avoid conflict. But when I got pregnant, he changed. He became even more caring and said that he wanted his son to be born into a complete family. He wanted Liam to have a father and for me to have a legal husband. The judge nodded, making notes on the file. When I was 8 months pregnant, we decided that after the birth of the child, we would officially get married. John wanted to introduce me to Rachel, but he continued to hesitate. He said that he was waiting for the right moment, that he wanted to do everything right. I tried not to put pressure, but it was hard for me. I understood that he was afraid of his daughter's reaction, but I also knew that sooner or later this conversation would take place. Emily looked at Rachel again. She seemed to be holding back her emotions, but her fingers nervously tapped on the table. But everything didn't happen as we planned, Emily continued. The day before I was due to give birth, John was hospitalized with a stroke. He was partially paralyzed. I was in the maternity hospital then and could not be near him. After discharge, I immediately went to the hospital, but he was too weak to decide anything. Registering the child was important, but John was physically unable to come to the office, so we did it through the online system. I registered Liam as his son, just like he wanted. Rachel's lawyer at that moment leaned towards his client and whispered something. The judge raised his eyebrows but said nothing. A month has passed. John was released from the hospital, but still needed rehabilitation. He was sent to a sanatorium where he was supposed to recover. We corresponded every day. He missed his son, wanted to see him. When he finally asked us to come, I didn't think twice about it. Liam and I went to the nursing home, and he held him for the first time. I've never seen him so happy. Emily paused, her voice trembling, but this happiness did not last long. Emily ran her hand over her face, holding back tears. There was a tense silence in the courtroom. She knew that the next part of her story would be the most difficult. Rachel showed up at that moment. She continued. She started screaming. She accused me of destroying their family, of taking advantage of her father's condition. I didn't want conflict. I took Liam and went for a walk to give them a chance to talk. When I returned, John looked very bad. The lips were blue, the face was pale. I was scared. I called the doctor. They put him on Enrollment 4, but Rachel didn't stop. She continued to scream, demanding that he give up on us. Emily clenched her fists. And then something happened that I will never forget. Rachel grabbed Liam and threw him towards John. There was a whisper in the hall. Even the judge frowned and looked closely at Rachel. She turned away, clasping her hands. Fortunately, he was in a blanket and was not injured. But John, he couldn't stand it. The doctor immediately said that he had a new attack. He was taken to intensive care, but the next morning they called me and said that he had died. Emily's voice broke. She closed her eyes, holding back tears. I believe that this conflict was the last straw. She got him there. She killed him with her words, with her hatred. That's why I'm here. I demand that Rachel be declared an unworthy heir. The judge made a note and looked at the defendant's lawyer. Defendant, you will have the opportunity to speak. But first I want to see evidence confirming or refuting the plaintiff's words. The trial continued. Chapter 3. Conflict in the Sanatorium. The sanatorium where John Walker was sent for rehabilitation was located in a quiet suburb of Chicago. It was a cozy place with spacious green lawns, long walking paths, and spacious wards where patients could recover from serious illnesses. The day Emily arrived there with Liam, the air was fresh and a light breeze swayed the trees, creating the illusion of peace. But this peace was deceptive. When they entered John's room, his face lit up with a smile. He sat in a chair by the window, covered with a light blanket, and seemed to look better than the day he was discharged from the hospital. "Oh my God," he whispered, looking at Liam. "How small he is, and so beautiful." Emily walked over carefully and placed her son in his arms. John looked touched. His fingers trembled slightly as he gently held the baby close to him. "I've been waiting for this moment for so long," he whispered, smiling tenderly. Liam. Emily didn't have time to enjoy this touching moment. The door to the room suddenly burst open and Rachel burst into the room. Her face was twisted with anger. Her eyes flashed lightning. She clearly did not expect to see this picture her father with a child in his arms and Emily next to him. "What's going on here?" Her voice trembled with rage. John looked up and sighed heavily. He clearly knew that this moment would come sooner or later, but he was not prepared for it. "Rachel," he began, but his daughter interrupted him. "You let this woman bring this child here." Her voice was loud, almost hysterical. "Haven't you even thought about how unpleasant this is for me?" Emily clenched her hands into fists, but remained calm. She didn't want to stir up conflict. "This is your brother, Rachel," she said calmly. "You can be angry with me all you want, but it's not Liam's fault that he was born." "Brother," Rachel laughed sarcastically. "Don't make me laugh. This is just a way to swindle out an inheritance. Have you thought about this, Dad? She's just using you." John frowned and hugged Liam slightly, as if protecting him. "That's enough, Rachel." His voice was tired but firm. "You have no right to say that. Liam is my son." "And I'm your daughter," she exclaimed. "Or have you forgotten about it?" Pain mixed with anger splashed in her eyes. She turned to Emily and literally pierced her with her gaze. "All this is because of you," she hissed. "You stole my father from me." "I didn't steal it," Emily answered quietly. "You were always important to him. You remain his daughter." But these words did not calm Rachel. She stepped forward sharply, and something dangerous flashed in her eyes. "If you really love him, you'll just go away and leave us alone," she shouted. "I'm not going to go anywhere," Emily answered firmly, "because Liam has a right to know his father." This exchange was so tense that it seemed that it became difficult to breathe in the ward. John suddenly clenched his temples and groaned. His face contorted in pain. "Dad?" Rachel suddenly froze. Her voice trembled. "John." Emily quickly stepped towards him. "Doctor," urgently. The door swung open again, and a nurse burst into the room. She saw John's condition and immediately rushed to him, taking out her phone from her pocket to call a doctor. But Rachel wasn't going to back down. She looked back at Emily, her breathing heavy, and then something completely unexpected happened. She grabbed the baby, and before anyone could react, she abruptly threw him towards John. Time seemed to slow down. Liam flew forward, wrapped in his blanket, and Emily screamed in horror. But fortunately, John managed to put his hands up and catch his son. "Are you crazy?" Emily roared, running up and snatching the child from John. The nurse looked at Rachel in complete shock. Her face turned pale. "You're out of your mind, miss. I'll call the police." Rachel's face transformed as the weight of her actions sank in. She appeared dazed, almost as if she couldn't fathom what she had just done. Before she could utter a word, two more doctors burst into the room. One of them wasted no time and immediately started examining John. "Stroke," muttered one of them, checking the patient's pulse. Emily held Liam to her chest, never taking her eyes off John. He looked even worse than before. His hands were shaking, His breathing was uneven. "We must take him away immediately," the doctor said, casting a quick glance at Emily. "Call the stretcher." Rachel stood in the middle of the room, still not moving. She clearly realized that it was she who brought the situation to a critical point. "I don't," she whispered, but her voice was shaking. Emily looked at her with cold fury. "You did it, Rachel," she said quietly. "You brought him to his senses." Rachel didn't answer. She simply watched as the paramedics prepared her father for transport. Everything happened so quickly, but the consequences of this day were to change their lives forever. Chapter 4. Defense of the Defendant. Rachel sat at the defendant's desk, her fingers intertwined and her eyes fixed on one spot in front of her. She looked collected, but anger and confusion flashed in her eyes. A tense silence reigned in the courtroom. After the dramatic events at the sanatorium, now it was her time to speak. The defendant's lawyer, Sarah Miller, stood up, cleared her throat, and, straightening up, addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the defense categorically denies the allegation that Miss Walker is responsible for the death of her father. We believe that the plaintiff is using emotive allegations that are not supported by evidence to deprive my client of her legal rights to the inheritance." Judge Williams nodded. "Continue." Sarah Miller took a few steps forward and stopped in front of the judge's table. "Yes, an incident occurred at the sanatorium. Yes, the parties came into conflict. But from a legal perspective, there is no evidence that Rachel Walker's actions directly caused her father's stroke. We are dealing with a man who had already suffered one stroke, was in a weakened state, and needed constant medical supervision." She turned her gaze to Emily, but she just looked at her coldly, without saying a word. "Moreover," the lawyer continued, "the witnesses confirm that Rachel had a nervous breakdown. A medical worker at the sanatorium treated her, and subsequently there was no evidence that she threatened the life of the baby or intentionally harmed the health of the father." Sarah Miller walked up to the defendant's desk, turned toward the room, and pointed at her client. "Rachel Walker is not indifferent to what happened. She lost her father, and now they are trying to make her out to be a monster, accusing her of a crime that she did not commit. She was shocked that her father, the man for whom she had sacrificed many of her life's plans, suddenly had a new family and a child she didn't even know." Rachel took a deep breath and looked at the judge. This was her moment. "Your Honor, I never meant to hurt my father. Yes, I was angry. Yes, I didn't understand why he hid this aspect of his life from me. But that doesn't make me a murderer." Her voice trembled, but she continued. "After my mother died, I stayed with him. He was depressed, and I felt it was my duty to be there. I gave up moving to New York, giving up my personal ambitions because I couldn't leave him alone. And when I finally came to terms with the fact that my life is built around him, suddenly Emily and her son appear, and it turns out that I am now a nobody in his eyes. Is this fair? Don't I at least deserve an explanation?" Rachel turned to Emily. "Are you saying he was happy when he first saw Liam? Okay, but why do I find out about this after his death? Why wasn't I given the opportunity to accept this differently?" Emily pressed her lips tightly together, but didn't answer. Judge Williams watched Rachel closely. He looked at her lawyer. "Do you want to add anything else?" Sarah Miller nodded. "Your Honor, we would like to present medical evidence confirming that John Walker had serious health problems prior to the incident at the sanatorium. Doctors warned that his condition was unstable and stress could be a trigger. However, we cannot say that it was the quarrel with my client that led to his death. This is speculation." She handed the judge a folder with documents. He leafed through it, nodding. "Accepted." Emily stood up abruptly. "Your Honor, but it was obvious. I saw him turn pale. I saw how he was choking. You understand that this particular moment was his last." The judge raised his hand, urging her to calm down. "Miss Carter, I understand your emotions, but the court requires evidence. Please have a seat." Emily sat up slowly, but her hands were still shaking. The judge made a few notes on the file and raised his head. "The court must consider all the circumstances. At this stage, there is no evidence to suggest that Rachel Walker acted with intent or that her conduct was criminal in nature. The court will review the medical documents submitted and also hear additional testimony. He paused, allowing the parties to process his words. We will move on to further analysis of the evidence at the next meeting. At the moment, I do not see sufficient grounds for recognizing the defendant as an unworthy heir. Rachel couldn't help but sigh in relief. Her lawyer gently patted her on the shoulder. Emily seemed stunned. She knew the fight was not over yet. The judge slammed his gavel. The meeting is over. The next hearing will take place in a week. People began to rise from their seats, but Emily sat still, aware that her accusations were not received as she had expected. And Rachel, although she didn't feel completely victorious, was finally able to exhale. Chapter 5. Court Decision. The court hearing had been going on for several hours, and the atmosphere in the room was tense to the limit. Judge Robert Williams, a man in his 60s with an attentive gaze and a stern expression, listened carefully to both sides. He has already heard the arguments of Emily Carter, who is representing her son, and the defense of Rachel Walker, who is accused of misconduct that allegedly led to the death of her father. Now the moment of truth has come. The judge took a deep breath, glanced over the records in the case, and raised his head. The court considered all the evidence presented, heard the parties, studied witness statements and medical reports. Based on the materials presented, I am ready to make a decision. His voice sounded even and calm, but there was a sense of firmness in it. There was absolute silence in the hall. Emily clenched her hands into fists, feeling her heart pounding in her chest. Rachel, on the other hand, sat with her back straight, but her fingers nervously tapped on the wooden table. First of all, the court must determine whether there were actions that can be qualified as unbecoming behavior of the heir under the laws of the state of Illinois, the judge continued. According to the law, an heir can be considered unworthy if his actions led to the death of the testator, or if he tried to influence the last will of the testator through threats, violence, or fraudulent manipulations. He turned his gaze to the plaintiff's side. The plaintiff claims that emotional stress caused by the conflict with his daughter caused John Walker to have a second stroke, which led to his death. However, the medical report states that John Walker already had a serious health condition, and any stress could have been a catalyst for deterioration. In this regard, the court cannot clearly link the conflict in the sanatorium with the immediate cause of death. Emily raised her head sharply. But she began, but the judge raised his hand, stopping her. I understand your emotions, Miss Carter, but the court's decision must be based on facts and evidence, not on assumptions. Your words are important, but without legal confirmation, they cannot be sufficient grounds for recognizing the defendant as an unworthy heir. He paused. Furthermore, witnesses confirmed that Rachel Walker had a nervous breakdown during the incident. This confirms that her actions were not intentional. Rachel took a deep breath, as if she was finally allowing herself to relax. Emily's lawyer nervously exchanged glances with her client, but did not interfere. Everything had already been said. In this regard, the court decides to dismiss the claim to recognize Rachel Walker as an unworthy heir, the judge announced. Emily exhaled sharply as if she had been hit in the chest. She turned to her lawyer, but he just shook his head, indicating that they had no reason to object further. However, the judge suddenly continued, drawing everyone's attention. The court also takes into account the fact that the plaintiff, Emily Carter, is acting on behalf of a minor child who is the biological son of John Walker. This means that he has full right to his share of the inheritance. Now it was Rachel's turn to tense up. She frowned, displeasure flashing across her face. Since there is a property dispute between the parties, the court orders that John Walker's estate be divided among the legal heirs. Accordingly, Rachel Walker and Liam Walker are equal heirs. The judge looked at both sides. Due to the fact that Liam is a minor, his share of the inheritance will be under the guardianship of his mother until he reaches adulthood. It's not fair, Rachel muttered quietly, but her lawyer quickly squeezed her hand, letting her know that now was not the time to object. The judge struck his gavel again. The court's decision is final and subject to immediate execution. The meeting is declared closed. There was tense silence in the hall for a moment, Then voices began to rustle. People began to rise from their seats, and lawyers discussed next steps with their clients. Emily still sat motionless, realizing that her main goal had not been achieved, but at least her son had received what was rightfully his. She looked at Liam, who was sleeping peacefully in his carrier. This trial was for his sake, for his future. Rachel stood up first. Her face was stony, but there was fatigue in her eyes. She looked at Emily and said, "You achieved your goal. I hope you're happy." Emily didn't answer. She simply took her son and headed towards the exit. The day was over, but her fight for Liam was just beginning. And what do you think? Was the judge's verdict fair? Write your thoughts in the comments below the video. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next crazier thing.